Well, good morning. Yesterday I spoke in Chase Auditorium on how much did the scribes corrupt the New Testament. Today it's on how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament. Did I just lose the sound? Y'all can hear me? Oh, okay, good. And I'm going to review a little bit from what we had yesterday as well, but I want to start by telling you what this is about. Yesterday was about the quantity of textual variants we have among our New Testament manuscripts. Today we're going to deal with the quality or the nature of those variants, whether theological issues, major theological issues, minor issues, for example, are involved. I think we would like to know if the deity of Christ is secure, if it's a doctrine that is taught in Scripture regardless of textual variants, or is it something that is taught that every single time the New Testament speaks of it, there's a textual variant that may say he's not God. That's kind of important for us to know. Or the virgin birth, or the Trinity, or the resurrection of Jesus, or justification by faith, all sorts of issues. Just to illustrate how important this is and how even the minor details can be significant, I want to tell you the story about a monk back in the 10th century in England. His name was Brother Andrew. He was studying at is kind of the equivalent of a theological seminary, but it's not quite a seminary in those days. And when he got all done with his several years of study, he spoke to the principal of the school, and the principal said, "Now I want you to go and you're going to be working at this monastery over here. So here's my letter of recommendation that I give with you, Andrew." So he went to this monastery, gave his letter of recommendation to the abbot. He had not seen it himself. And the abbot looked at it, and it said that this young man, Brother Andrew, was really anal. I don't think they use that word in 10th century England, but and is it okay for me to use that here? Okay, some of you are not laughing, so maybe not. Anyway, so Brother Andrew was recommended by the principal, who said he really needs to be one who copies out the bylaws of the monastery, because he'll be very, very exacting, and you can keep him shuttled away in one room all by himself all day long. So here he is, he sees the abbot, and the abbot says, "I have just the job for you, and I want you to start immediately. I want you to copy out the bylaws of the monastery that go back several centuries." And so he puts him into a room, and Andrew starts copying this out. And about 45 minutes later, he comes back in, knocks on the door of the abbot, and he says, "Holy Father, there seems to be a discrepancy among these manuscripts. Have you got some older ones that I can copy?" So the abbot says, "Yes, we do have some older ones. We've never let anybody on the first day here look at those, but I understand that you'll be careful with them." So he said, "Here, I'll take you to this other room," and Andrew started copying those out. And about 45 minutes later, he comes back into the room, and he says, "Holy Father, we still have some discrepancies. Have you got some older manuscripts?" And the abbot looked at him and said, "Young man, the only older manuscripts we have are in the archives room, and those are the original manuscripts of the bylaws for this monastery. Nobody has seen those in centuries. But I'm going to take you down there and let you copy those out, as long as you're extremely careful." So he took him down this labyrinthian path, serpentine path, to get to the bowels of the library, where Brother Andrew is in this room all by himself, copying out the original documents of the bylaws for this monastery. And about 20 minutes later, there were about 20 hands pounding on the door of the abbot's office. It was all the rest of the monks. And he opens the door, and they said, "Holy Father, this new monk has gone berserk. He's nuts. He's gone crazy. You got to see what he's doing." So they all scurry down into this archives room, and they see Brother Andrew weeping and pounding his fist on the desk. And the abbot says, "Young man, what's the problem?" "They left out the letter R." He said, "Oh my gosh, this guy is anal." "What do you mean they left out the letter R? The word is supposed to be celebrate." Now, those were interesting reactions from you guys. Kind of this group over here got it first, and then it kind of rolls along here. Then over here we get boos. I don't know what that means, but maybe we have some Westmont transplants. I'm not sure, but anyway. Sometimes the most minor details are important for us to look at when we think about textual criticism or the text of the New Testament. So how badly did the scribes corrupt the text? Let me just review a couple things from yesterday. I want to quote from that great scholar Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code when he said, "The Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." We've all heard that kind of comment. The Bible has been translated so many times we can't possibly get back to the original. And we dealt with those issues, especially yesterday. But we also quoted from Bart Ehrman, who is America's #1 religious skeptic. He is somebody who came out of evangelicalism. He was a Moody Bible Institute student, graduated from Wheaton College, got his master's and doctorate from Princeton Seminary, and studied under Bruce Metzger, a very fine evangelical New Testament scholar. And then Ehrman became an agnostic years later. And he says in his book, Misquoting Jesus, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. Now, he goes on and he says this, which is relevant to what we're going to be looking at today. "The more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them." Now, what I want to point out is that Dr. Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, is the first popular book on textual criticism that ever made it anywhere. It ended up being a New York Times bestseller, in part because he was on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. And Stewart interviews him, and Ehrman talks about several passages that are surely not authentic. And Stewart ends up by saying, "I want to congratulate you, sir, that's one hell of a book." Not the normal kind of accolade you'd give to a book about Jesus, but nevertheless, that's what Stewart said. The next day, this book was #1 on Amazon, and he sold over 100,000 copies of it in 3 months. This book has been used by a number of people. I'd say, with no exaggeration, tens of thousands of people have abandoned the Christian faith because of the writings of Bart Ehrman, and especially because of Misquoting Jesus. Now, Bart and I are friends. We've been friends for over 30 years, and we've debated each other 3 times, but I'm going to come back to this book at the end of the lecture. So I want you to keep this in mind, Misquoting Jesus and what he says at the end. Well, there's 2 attitudes that we want to avoid. Again, this is a repeat from yesterday. Radical skepticism, which is what Dan Brown, Bart Ehrman, and others hold to, where you can't possibly get back to the original text. And finally, to absolute certainty, which most of you probably hold to, because if someone uses an NIV, they might say, this is exactly the Word of God in every respect. Somebody sitting next to you might use the ESV, and they say the same thing. Well, they are not both exactly the Word of God. They are both translations of the original, and even the original that they translate are going to differ in a few places. And even the NIV from 1984 to 2011 differs from itself in a few places. So we can't have absolute certainty that what we have in our hands today is exactly, in every particular, the Word of God. But we don't have to have radical skepticism either. So we'll see where in these 2 extremes we should fall out. There's 4 questions that we want to answer. One we answered yesterday, which was, how many textual variants are there? Today we're going to look at what kinds of textual variants there are, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages, and the bottom line is, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? So once again, the quantity of variants, this is how I looked at this yesterday. We have about 140,000 words in the New Testament, and about 400,000 textual variants among the manuscripts. That's an average of 2.5 variants for every word in the New Testament. Now, that may sound like an absolutely amazing, huge number of variants. And we're going to see if that really is the case. Is 400,000 variants, 2.5 variants per word, that significant? I'm going to argue that actually I'm surprised that it's that low. One of the reasons, in fact, the major reason that we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. And we looked at an embarrassment of riches yesterday. Again, some of you were not here yesterday, and if you were, it's probably good to review this because it's a lot of content. And today we're going to have a lot more fun by looking at some different facts. But we have over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, over 10,000 manuscripts of the New Testament written in Latin starting in the 2nd century, late 2nd century. Other ancient versions of the New Testament, between 5,000 and 10,000 of these. In other words, we have maybe 20,000 manuscripts, 25,000 manuscripts. It's an incredible amount of manuscripts we have that are handwritten copies of the New Testament prior to the time of the printing press. And if we wiped all those out, we could still reconstruct the entire text of the New Testament virtually many times over on the basis of the quotations by ancient church fathers alone. To date, we have well over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by these church fathers. The New Testament is in far better shape textually than any other ancient document. It's in better shape than any Greco-Roman document by far. And the second best one is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Together, we have almost 1,800 manuscripts by Homer, copies of Homer. Homer has a 900-year head start on the New Testament, though, and we have less than 1/10 as many manuscripts of Homer as we do the New Testament. If you look at several other classical authors, though, what we would discover is the average classical author has fewer than 20 manuscripts in existence today. And if you stack those up, they'll be about 4 feet high. Now, you stack up the New Testament against it, it's going to be a lot higher than 4 feet. Keep going. All right, thank you. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Now, let me quantify that for you. That's as far as I wanted to go in PowerPoint. It's 8 times bigger than that stack. We have over 6,600 feet of manuscripts of the New Testament, if you just stacked them straight up. 4 feet for the average classical author. In other words, we have well over 1,000 times more textual evidence for the New Testament than we do the average classical Greek or Latin author. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So when people say, well, how can we get back to the original New Testament? We have no idea what it really said. We say, well, first of all, we have far greater evidence for the New Testament than anything else. Do you believe a guy named Julius Caesar actually lived? Well, think about the evidence that we have for him, or Alexander the Great in particular. Alexander the Great, we have biographers that are coming centuries later, and then their manuscripts are coming many centuries after that. And then we also talked about the date of New Testament manuscripts. P52, our earliest known New Testament manuscript, at least so far, from the first half of the 2nd century, between 100 and 150. We have as many as a dozen manuscripts from the 2nd century. They're all fragmentary, they're all papyri, but one of these at the very edge of the 2nd century, at AD 200, right around there, is P46. It's the oldest manuscript of Paul's letters. And that manuscript originally had 104 leaves to it. Today, it still has 86 of those leaves. And last summer, my institute, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, had the privilege of going to Dublin to the Chester Beatty Library to digitize that manuscript as well as all their other Greek New Testament manuscripts. And there's 30 leaves of this at the University of Michigan. We digitized those in July. We will be publishing 6 volumes on these papyri, where the photographs of them are going to be in the volumes as well as the text. And what we're discovering from our digital photography is we can see things in these manuscripts that have not been able to be seen by anybody before. It's very exciting, some of the new things we're discovering in the very oldest manuscript of Paul's letters. But basically what all this tells us is that an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. People give all sorts of arguments against the scripture. We say, well, let's look at the evidence. The average classical author doesn't have a single manuscript for half a millennium. The New Testament, we're waiting decades, not hundreds of years, not half a millennium, just a few decades before we start getting copies. Okay, now that brings us to today. The quality of variants, what kinds of variants are there? Well, 99% of all these 400,000 variants, in fact, more than 99%, make virtually no difference at all. For example, there's differences in spelling among the manuscripts. Sorry about that. But I think you knew what I meant, right? In fact, probably some of you didn't even recognize that was a mistake, especially if you came from Santa Barbara. All right, now let's... I've been playing with an issue when it comes to these differences in spelling and some other issues in the Greek. About 70% of our texture variances are differences in spelling, 70% of them. It affects nothing. You can't even translate them. And for example, the name for John in Greek is either Ioannes with two N's, two N's, or Ioannes with one. Every time you see John in the New Testament, there's going to be manuscripts that spell it one way and manuscripts that spell it the other, every single time. And each one of those counts as one textual variant, regardless of how many hundreds of manuscripts you have for it. There's also this thing known as the Moveable Nu, which is an N at the end of a word when the next word starts with a vowel, like when we say a book or an apple, or in Santa Barbara, a book, a apple. I like Santa Barbara, actually, but you know, I'm from Newport Beach. The surf's just a whole lot better down there. And then there's the Greek article. Now, I wrote my master's thesis on when the article does not appear in a Greek construction. And then I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it does appear. Those two works could cure the most hopeless insomniac. We have 20,000 articles in the Greek New Testament. 1 out of 7 words is the Greek article. And scholars are still not sure exactly why it is being used in some places. For example, we read in Luke 3 about the Joseph and the Mary left Jerusalem with this group, and the Jesus was not with them. Well, we never translate it that way. We're not exactly sure why the article is used with proper names. But one thing I started to wrestle with, and I started to look at this last year especially, and that is, how many ways can you say John loves Mary in Greek? Well, John could be spelled a number of different ways. Mary could be spelled a number of different ways. And we're not dealing with movable news, but we are dealing with the presence of the article, the lack of it, word order differences, things like this. So when you think about word order in Greek, because it's a highly inflected language, you could say John loves Mary, and the order could be Mary loves John. But any Greek would know that that means John loves Mary because of the endings on the word. Or you could say, loves John Mary, loves Mary John, any order you want. And then you throw in the article. And so I began to wrestle with this, and I thought, how many ways can you say John loves Mary in Greek? So I want to show you what these ways are, and you need to get out pen and paper because you'll need to write all these down. Here's the first 8 ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek. And here's another 8 ways. You're not taking notes. This is going to show up on the quiz. I want you to know that. So, and here's some more ways. And some more. Every one of these is different. Every single one is different. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing the meaning at all. However, if you add conjunctions that are often untranslated, there's some more ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. And so we have, you're still not taking notes. I don't know what your problem is. 384 ways that you can say John loves Mary in Greek. And every time it means John loves Mary. There's other legitimate word orders. I got tired after doing this. It took me 8 hours to put all those Greek constructions together. It swelled the numbers to over 500. And then if you throw in a different verb for loves, where the meaning is a little bit different, it mushrooms the numbers to nearly 1,200. That's how many ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek, where it really doesn't affect very, very much at all. Now, Bart Ehrman in Misquoting Jesus says, we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Now, this is an absolutely true statement and a terribly misleading statement. Because if we went on talking nearly forever about these textual variants, we'd all be bored to tears, because most of them are just spelling differences. Oh, do we have two news or do we have one new? And Ehrman knows that most of these, the ones in the thousands, no textual critic in his right mind would ever spend any time on. Now, Bart and I are members of Society of Biblical Literature, and we meet somewhere in North America for 3 days every November. We have about 10,000 scholars that converge on a major city. And in this small group of scholars that get together to discuss the texts of the New Testament, maybe 30, 40, 50 people, we have papers that are presented, people that give lectures on textual problems. I've never heard one get up there and say, now, I'm going to talk to you about the difference in spelling between this word and this word, because it makes no difference, it's not significant, but it's what I want to talk about. We don't do stuff that's insignificant. He knows that if we talked about the thousands of variants, everybody would just tear their eyes out. It'd be just awful in terms of the total boredom we'd have. So if we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants, the 400,000 textual variants, is meaningless. What counts is the nature of those variants. So let's look at the smallest group of variants, those that are both meaningful, that is, they do affect the meaning to some degree, and they're viable. They actually have a good chance of being authentic. Now, what's not a viable variant is something that's found in a very late medieval manuscript or in just some Coptic text or just Latin or something like that. Those that are viable are found in early manuscripts or have a sufficient pedigree that they could actually go back to the original text. And less than 1% of all textual variants fit this group. My guess is it's about 1/4 of 1% that actually are both meaningful and viable. I'm going to give you two examples. Mark chapter 9, verse 29, Jesus said to his disciples, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting." Most later manuscripts add. Now, he was talking to his disciples after they tried to exorcise some particularly pesky demons, and the demons didn't come out, so Jesus said, "This kind cannot come out unless you are praying." And perhaps he was saying fasting. This is the only place that we've got where fasting becomes a requirement for the Christian in any aspect of their life that we find in the New Testament. Now, scholars debate this back and forth, but most scholars would say that the shorter reading is authentic, and just by looking at me, you can realize that I agree with the shorter reading. So let's press on to something a little bit less convicting and look at another fascinating textual variant, Revelation 13:18. This is a verse we all know. "Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Everybody knows the Antichrist, that's 666. If you were to Google it, and please don't do it now, you'd get some of the nuttiest, weirdest stuff you'd ever find on the internet about 666. The problem is that might not be the number of the beast. In 1843, a German scholar was studying at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and he discovered a reading in a manuscript that had been scraped over 800 years after it was originally written. It's a very early Greek New Testament manuscript, scraped over and written on top of, so it was almost impossible to read the undertext. He spent 2 years with that manuscript and was able to determine at Revelation 13:18 the number of the beast in that manuscript is 616. Well, this was the only manuscript known at the time that had 616 as the number of the beast. And it turned out to be one of our very most important New Testament manuscripts. For those of you who are studying Greek, it's Ephremi Rescriptus or Codex C. And the scholar who discovered this was a man named Constantine von Tischendorf, who the very next year after he got done with this great discovery, went to St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai and discovered Sinaiticus, our oldest complete New Testament. Well, 616 then, it was interesting, and it's in a very important manuscript, but most scholars would say, no, that's not it. Most scholars, in fact, would say, 616, that's not the number of the beast, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down, so we're not sure, but anyway. But then in 1998, 17 papyri were published that were discovered at Oxford University in their Ashmolean Museum. They had been actually dug up 100 years earlier, and all of a sudden these 17 New Testament papyri were published. And one of them, which happens now to be our oldest fragment for this chapter in Revelation, it's 26 little postage stamp size fragments that spread out over 9 chapters in Revelation. And it says that the number of the beast is 616. Well, I wanted to make sure that that was the case. So I had the opportunity to look both at this manuscript at the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford under a magnifying glass and a microscope, and I also looked at the manuscript that Tischendorf had deciphered at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And absolutely clear as day, both of them say 616. Now, we have the oldest manuscript, one of the most important manuscripts. They're both saying the number of the beast is 616. I don't know if that's right. It would take a long time to determine it, and we still wouldn't be absolutely certain. There are some scholars who say, yes, that is the number of the beast, 616. So this would have an important significance for the New Testament, for our understanding of who the Antichrist is. However, how important is this really? I know of no Bible college, no theological seminary, no theological institute, no church, no denomination that puts in its doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth, we believe in the deity of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It may be important, but it's not that important. So, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Back to the Da Vinci Code. We see what Sir Lee Teabing says, my dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless a mortal. That moment is the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and Dan Brown, as many people like to argue, say that Emperor Constantine invented the deity of Christ in 325. Now, it's such a loony view, and yet people say these things without having any basis for it. Even professors at major universities. 2 of my 4 boys were in major universities studying when this book came out. And each one of them had a professor who said, here's finally a book that proves that Christianity is rooted in myth. Really? Well, let's look at a bit of evidence. Here's a picture of that handsome emperor, by the way. Remember how I said an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Here's an ounce of evidence. This is P66, one of our oldest manuscripts of John's Gospel. And this is the very first leaf of John, where it says, Euangelion kata Ioanne, the Gospel according to John. And I want to read John 1:1 with you. This was published, or was not published, but actually written about 150 years before Constantine's Council of Nicaea. So read along with me in verse 1, if you would. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You've never heard that before, right? Of course we have. I don't think Constantine was 200 years old when the Council of Nicaea met. And yet there are people who say he invented the deity of Christ because they have no clue what they're talking about. Every single manuscript of John's Gospel, no matter the date or the language, says virtually the same thing in John 1:1, that Jesus is unequivocally called God. And the same can be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming. In fact, there is no major doctrine that is affected by any one of these variants. Let me quote from that great scholar, Bart Ehrman, and he is a great scholar, what he said about this in the back of Misquoting Jesus in an appendix that was published in a paperback version of his book, and then it was taken out later because of his answers, I think. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy, the editors say, based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? They were trying to even pump up the sales, even though it was a remarkable selling book. Look at what Ehrman says in response. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. I'm not quoting some Orthodox guy, I'm quoting Dr. Ehrman on this. And so I want to give you, to conclude, an unnatural segue. A polar bear attacks a man in Canada and bystanders do nothing. The media didn't even report this incident. Must be liberal media for some reason. Now, get in your minds a picture of a polar bear attacking a man in Canada. You got it fixed? What I just told you is the truth. And this is the truth. It's a little bit different picture probably than what you had, right? 400,000 variants for the New Testament. Well, you may think of a polar bear attacking a man, but this is the polar bear. And at worst, he's going to shred a few little parts of his 501 blues. No essential doctrine is affected by any viable variant.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.